Welcome to the Performance Health Podcast. My name is Tim Caron. Today we have Coach Rob Jacobs on, and this was a really fun episode. He's got a bunch of really interesting concepts that are going to help you unpack program design. You know, going back to that central question, what is a good program? With Rob, it comes down to really finding the right input to get the right output. If you like what you're hearing, head over to strength&conditioningcoach.com. We've got a bunch of really great resources. New resource out there called the Strength&Coach Longevity Index. It's going to break up into 4 quadrants: your metabolic health, your physical capacity, your circadian performance, as well as finally your body composition. It's about understanding where you stack with all those to get longevity in your career in strength conditioning. It is a must-have resource for every strength coach. You get access to our ebook as well as you get access to our calculator in the Strength TC app, as well as all of our other great resources like our training sports teams book. We have our strength deficit book, our how to become a strength coach book, and we have several courses like our foundations course, the strength deficit course, as well as an in-person course coming up here in June, our level 1 biomechanics course. Head over to strength.tc.com to get everything you need to be a very complete and very, very good strength conditioning coach. All right, let's get talking to Rob. All right, everybody, we got Coach Rob Jacobs on. Fired up to have you on. Thank you so much for being here. Rob, I'm going to ask you right off the bat, walk me through your programming workflow, start to finish. You have a new client or a new team you're working with. Where do you start?
So first thing, obviously, we'll go through assessments, right? We'll look at biomechanical assessment, and then some sort of, it used to be the Braverman test or, whatever you're using now. I've got my own thing that I use. So those are my first 2 primary things. I give them the questionnaire, the neural performance map first. It gives me a good idea of how to talk to them, what motivates them, and where they're at now, right? Who am I dealing with from a not just a psychological perspective, but just a state of how stressed the nervous system is, which I guess is really the differentiator with what my system is now versus just the Braverman, right? And then that biomechanical assessment. And, I think we've been through the same kind of coaching family tree. And one of the things I run into a lot when I'm talking to other coaches or looking at younger coaches is you do that awesome, biomechanical assessment, whatever yours is. And then people end up not actually using it when they write the program. It's like, all right, you failed your straight leg raise, your Thomas test on the table was just an unmitigated bilateral disaster. But let's start some dynamic effort speed squats. We'll do some max effort deadlifts, and we'll go from there. And it's like, all right, are we going to use this for anything? So those are my main 2 kind of first decision points, right? I think everything should be based off of that, and then those give you your ideals, right? What exercises can this person currently handle? What exercises do I need to do to fix any of those biomechanical issues? The neural performance map can kind of help me. If I had my druthers, can help me navigate splits and macro cycles, microcycles, mesocycles, specific to what that nervous system state is, or regulatory state is what we call it in the system. And then you kind of figure out they can only train 3 times a week, or, whatever my scenario is. And then you take ideal and funnel that down to what's actually practical and what you have. So those are my first kind of 3 decision points. Then we get into blood work and, any of that stuff later on down the line.
Well, let's unpack the biomechanical aspect. And one thing that I've kind of always wondered about is you do a table test, and then from there it goes into some sort of decision making, right? Let's say they had a failed Thomas test, meaning they couldn't get hip extension and they started to externally rotate, or maybe they felt pain. And does that immediately start this process of going, certain exercises are off the table? Or is it, I need to unpack more? So let's just hypothetical, let's say it was a Thomas test and they failed it for whatever reason. What from there do you want to find more information of, or what are you already ruling out?
So it's I'd say a little bit of both, right? You can, if you have the skill set with some of the PIMS or the acupressure or any of that stuff, one of the first things, depending on the person, right? Because a more fast twitch, more explosive, an already strong individual is going to respond really fast to the PIMP stuff, right? Way more than, a Gen Pop person that's never really lifted before. You can get, there's definitely times, especially with some shoulders and stuff, I've even done it on, I think an 11 or a 12-year-old, had her take her earrings out, just a little light, PIMPs work on the shoulder, and Well, now all of a sudden we're not failing the external rotation tests anymore, right? Well, was it actually a problem, or can I just do that? And now these exercises aren't off limits. So, it's kind of a little bit of a fact finding mission to a degree of how bad that Thomas test is, right? Like, all right, the rec fem is clearly disproportionate on one side versus the other. So, all right, well, that light bulb goes off like, well, all right, that's going to rule out any bilateral squatting or really even any bilateral like actual deadlifting till that's fixed. But then you go, all right, well, the tools that I have, can I correct that deficit to even it out before our training session so that we can then still train a bilateral, like if it's an athlete, right? Like, a gen pop person, you don't even really need to, really don't need that thought. But if I've got an athlete that needs to get stronger and faster, if I can have them doing more advanced things like a bilateral squat or versus a split squat, then you can go that route, and then you use your split squats, your unilateral structural work to correct that initial problem by the end of the program. And so that was kind of one of the aspects that I really got from Woodsky when he was my coach, right? Like I definitely had some QL discrepancies. I had some bilateral deficits, we call them. But I still did bilateral squatting, but almost all of my B, C stuff was unilateral. That's where we're hitting our split squats. That's where we're hitting our step ups. We're hitting all that stuff in those later series. And then, you retest that at the end of 10, 12 weeks, and that bilateral deficit has improved. And, so at that time, like I wasn't competing in any, that was before I decided to do strongman or any of that stuff. So you can kind of go both those routes depending on what your like immediate needs are. And I feel like you gotta dig a little bit more either with the individual, why they're coming to you, or the situation you're in,
You mentioned applying some pimps to an athlete that had a failed test, and you're trying to tease out whether it's some sort of nervous system restriction or actually some sort of structural issue. How do you maintain discipline and not trying to fix it in that moment and kind of making, I guess, noisy data in that interpretation, right? So they have failed Thomas tests, and the immediate reaction is like, okay, I want to help this person and fix it. But also too, I know it's gonna be a long drawn out process. And sometimes I found when you have this quick fix or this magic that you can do with them, it's not a permanent solution. It's just in the moment made it better because it's some sort of nervous system thing. To go in that level of like, okay, I need to maintain composure here because I know I can apply some sort of strategy and not just jump to this conclusion. And the real work's going to begin after this assessment. How do you have that, like, I guess, discipline in the moment to not rush to fixing or doing a quick like magic trick, and then on the other end of it, knowing the real actual work begins on that first session beyond?
Yeah, I mean, early on, like right after you learn that stuff, it's really hard to not just do it in every scenario and be like, yeah, totally fixed you. Let's go let's go squat. But I think a lot of it too is how bad that discrepancy is. Like if you're just a fraction off of an ideal scenario in terms of a range of motion, then like, yeah, okay, a little bit of work, a little bit of gua sha, and you're there. But you also have to know that those adjustments aren't permanent, right? Like I don't care how great that improvement is in the PIMS, it's not going to last unless you do something to make it last. And like, that's kind of part of that process is, okay, I've gotten you this range of motion. And now if I don't get you strong in this new range of motion intentionally, deliberately at a pretty high frequency, right? Like, one of the things we'll do is we use the Dublay's method for structural balance, right? You a couple of sets of external rotators as your A and then as your final series, but you got to see that multiple times a week too, right? You can't just do that on Monday because that's your chest day and then never see it again for 7 days. It doesn't really matter. So I think that like that's a pretty important part of that discipline is knowing that you are not fixing that discrepancy with that modality, right? You are creating an opportunity to fix it faster, but you're not alleviating it. And so one of the things that I've built into that neural performance assessment is actually what some of the levers are under the stress based on the nervous system. So, because what we'll run into, right, is you do your eye exercises and you get an improvement in something, or you do, saccades or some vestibular work and you get an improvement in balance, you get an improvement in range of motion. You do your your pimps, whatever, right? All of that stuff, some of your PRI stuff. And then those modalities fix it in the moment, but they don't stick super hard. And you can start to pin down what the input is that is causing the stress response to be off, right? Like, is it a translation of the head or the skull that's making the eyes be the primary limiting factor? Like, okay, we can do all the eye exercises you want. If you're not fixing that lateral translation, now the input coming directly into the eyes is not, you'll get a transient improvement or an acute improvement. You're never going to get long-term improvement. So you can start to narrow down what that first lever of stress is. Is it an energy reserve problem, right? Are they just overstressed and it doesn't matter what you do, that problem's not going to get fixed? So like if it's an anxiety issue, some of the PRI work is with rib cage stuff, diaphragm, that may be one of your most important modalities. If it's a stress bucket type of issue, some of the eye stuff may be one of your first things. If it's just purely mechanical, purely length tension, and you rule out all those other causes, then some PIM stuff might be your hands down fastest solution. So the quicker you can narrow down all those tools that a lot of us are starting to accumulate in our toolbox, but we do see, it's like supplement protocols. You see them work in the short term, but they never actually fix a problem because you're not addressing the real root cause of what you're using that modality to attempt to correct.
So one thing that I was kind of interested on is going into this, let's say you move past I did this assessment and I did some sort of just appraisal of whether it's a nervous system thing or a health thing or a capacity thing. And then you move into your programming. And let's hypothetically talk about you did what Woodsky did with you with another one of your clients because you found some sort of bilateral deficit. And that decision to go, okay, we're going to do an A1 of a bilateral lower body movement, like a leg press, and then we're going to move into our B, C, and D series as like all unilateral exercises. What is the process of the length of time you want to stick with that training format? And when you start to pivot towards, okay, now I feel like we corrected a lot of these issues and we want to get into a little bit more threshold by loading up with more bilateral patterns. And now moving into the next phase of it. Like from a progression standpoint, what is the process to work through in the necessary period of time to create the adaptation to move on to the next phase of it? Or is that like kind of like, hey, I want to stick with this until the wheels come off?
So I think one of the things about the Woodsky style of approach, I think, is when you are far less time constrained, right? Because that approach is kind of textbook fitting into concurrent models and vertical integration, right? There's always going to be some sort of strength work there. Is it going to be bilateral? Is it unilateral? There'll be speed work in there eventually in the program, and there's metabolic work in there. And understanding that the more of those things you introduce, the longer time period you're going to need to see a similar type of result. Whereas, if I've got 4 to 6 weeks with an athlete in the off season and I see a bilateral discrepancy, I'm not so much worried about getting their back squats, stupid strong. You're here, let's fix this problem so you can then leave me, go do your thing. And we either try to do some maintenance work in the off season if we're lucky enough to be able to do that, or when you come back, you're at least hopefully able to express some of those, your strength and your power and all those demands, in your sport and your season. So I think that time period and also understanding what you choose to do is going to extend that time period, right? Like the more I listen to Bondarchuk's stuff, and like he does the same exercises basically until you hit peak, and then you change the exercises. And one of the things that he just kind of beats into your head as you read his stuff is that the more frequently you change your exercises, the longer it takes to reach a peak. And, so that like Bondarchuk could peak somebody in 6 to 8 weeks. Whereas we look at traditional periodization, you're automatically somewhat wrongfully pigeonholed into 12, depending on what you're trying to peak for. Right. So I think understanding that too, like if I got 6 weeks, it's going to be a bit more of a Poliquin approach where fix the weakest link, and then everything else is going to get better no matter what it is. Versus if I've gen pop, I got 6 months. Yeah, let's get you a little bit stronger. Somebody comes to you like, I really want to bench XYZ, and they got jacked up shoulders, or, maybe not jacked up, but there's a shoulder problem, you can fix. Retention may be a little bit better depending on that person if they bench. If somebody comes to you and says, I want to bench 225 for 15, and you go 12 weeks with them and they don't bench, odds of them signing up might not be very high, depending on your relationship with them. So you got to kind of balance some of that stuff with, with what their goals are. Or if they're coming to you for fat loss and all you're doing is, moderately challenging structural balance work for the first 12 weeks, how good is that going to be for your retention, depending on that person?
Now, you kind of touched on a couple different things there in the idea of the peaking and versus working on weaker links or structural balances issues. And as we start to break down, a vector of a program, you're moving towards something or moving away from something is the kind of the easiest way I like to articulate it. And you got a failed test and you got a bunch of things you need to work on to improve because it creates some sort of rate limiter into what you want to get versus you're still holding yourself accountable to reaching some sort of apex of your program. So when you are deciding on this, and I know you work with a lot of special needs cases of like an athlete that's got a small period of time to do something, or an actor that needs to prepare for a role. How do you balance between a very hard timeline and date that you need to get something accomplished with all the variables you need to account for from previous injury, limited training history, deconditioned, et cetera, and moving through that? Because you can easily just throw a bunch of stuff at them and it's not really going to move the needle towards their goal versus the other end of it of, okay, if I just get myopic focus on the goal and I never really address these underlying issues, they can go into that next phase, whether it's season or during a shoot, and just feel like absolute dog shit. So, walk us through that, like that dance you play with working from something and working towards something.
I think a lot of that is being able to understand after your assessment what the biggest limiting factor is for an individual, right? I think one of the best examples of this that I had was a kid. He came to me, it was right during the COVID shutdowns, and he was leaving a small school and wanted to walk on somewhere. And I mean, this kid was as fast twitch as you could imagine anyone being. So expressing elasticity and being explosive and fairly strong were not weak links to the biomechanical assessment, right? It wasn't necessarily force discrepancies, but like we watched the kid vertical jump, watch him broad jump, and the knee was ridiculously unstable, right? So you start to look at, okay, this kid is like running very fast 40-yard times. I mean, he was sub 4.4 with just janky knee, man. I forget how high his vert and his broad jump were, but they were good. Like they were very good for his position, for his size, for everything. And so you start to look at those factors, and his rate limiting factor was that joint integrity, right? Like Charles said something similar when he trained, who was it? Dwight Phillips, right? Like you look at that program and it's almost a functional hypertrophy program because the guy was already able to touch his head on a, 15-foot ceiling or 12 foot, whatever it was, right? Charles didn't need to make him crazy explosive. That was already there. He just needed to increase the size of his engine and improve its efficiency. So being able to take your diagnostics and kind of understand that, like, all right, this kid's running very fast times. Is it a speed, a strength issue? Is it a transfer issue? Or like, wow, this knee is really bad, And so we put, it's like 14, 16 inches on this kid's broad jump in 6 weeks with split squats and step ups and, some snatch grip deadlifts. That the only heavy bilateral leg work that was done were some snatch grip deadlifts. But by the end of those 6 weeks, his knee was like dead on, right? And we saw that expression of that broad jump was tremendous, because that was just the only thing that I really wanted to see for his start, right? But if I had tried to boost his power clean or any of that stuff, like maybe we get a few inches, or you go the traditional route, but you fix that weak link. So and it could be, you got to understand what that is, right? Does he need are his knee flexors too weak for his quads, right? Is he hamstring dominant? Or is this individual just too weak? Like my problem in strongman was I was just too weak compared to the guys I was competing against. I just needed to get stronger. It wasn't any like grandiose structural balance issue. It's like I'm 6'3" and a 5'9" guy can out deadlift me. Just got to get stronger.
Now you're moving into your program, you're rolling along. How are you assessing the progress that the person's making, and what adjustments are you making if they're not making enough progress, as well as the other end of it of they're moving faster than you expected? Do you make any adjustments on that end? And what is your process of evaluating the week to week change, and how are you making decisions from one week to the next, whether it's more or less?
So a lot of the layout from start to finish is almost exclusively precisely influenced by the map, the neural performance map. And that within that, you have a gauge of 4% increases, 8% increases in intensity versus understanding based on the current state of the nervous system, what needs to be progressed first, load, volume, or intensity. And by understanding that, you get a good picture of week to week, phase to phase, session to session, right? Given a good picture of also, if you're doing, say, 1-6, you can't do that for every session of a 4-session training with this individual. This one, maybe, this guy, maybe 2, right? But being able to structure a microcycle from day to day, knowing the state of the current nervous system. And once you have a handle on that, whether it's my system or some other system, your ability to progress, you really don't run into plateaus that much unless an injury shows up. So that's why I talk about these systems so much, whether it's Braverman or now my system that's a little bit more all encompassing. It eliminates plateaus, and you just have to get a good idea of the individual and knowing how to progress. But also at the same time, you have a blueprint of 12 weeks, right? And I need to be, here's my step-by-step process for day 0 to day whatever. But then also understanding real life happens, right? If I had a client develop an ulcer, all right, stopping right there, regroup, whatever, you have an injury or something, being able to adjust the plan and regroup. So it's not writing a year's worth of program. You're not even really writing 12 weeks, but mapping out that blueprint and understanding if each phase goes according to plan, here's where we go next.
Now, you mentioned progressing load and intensity. Could you explain the difference between load and intensity?
Yeah. So with load, you could look at, it could be a few different things, but it's more of a general term of just under load, right? So I probably should have said sets, sorry. But with intensity, obviously you're looking at a percent of that, the 1 RM continuum. Whereas load, you can also break that down into mechanical work, right? Because I think that's one thing that a lot of the polyclones kind of don't consider, because they are so zeroed in on, if you don't use a 4-0-1-0 tempo on every movement from now until the end of time, you're not actually training. But all right, if I do 20 reps of 2-0-1-0 and 6 reps of 4-0-1-0, I did more mechanical work with that set of 20, even though the tempo was faster, right? So there's going to be some differences in how that feels under load versus the time, just the time under tension response, right? Like those two things aren't the same, and people will respond to them a little bit differently. So you kind of have to, it's different ways to skin a cat also, right? Where it's like, you give me 20 reps, I don't care what the tempo is, my performance is going to get worse by the second. Whereas you give me a set of 6, even if it's an 8-0 tempo, same time under tension, less mechanical work is going to go better for some people,
So, with that being said, is you're blending the mechanical load, the intensity, and the volume of things, whether it's, which I'm assuming volume is the aggregate of reps and time under tension. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and sets will fall in
Sets.
there as well too.
Okay. So so all that being considered is okay, now you got all these three variables that you're looking at between load, volume, and intensity. And you're looking at the 8 weeks, 1 week to the next, you're going to see variance in a 4 and 8, maybe a 10% increase based off of, okay, this is a mechanical load, this is a intensity based load, this is an overall volume play, and I'm going to see changes there. And then you don't. And obviously the lifestyle factors are in there, but let's just say that we're living in a vacuum and we have a bunch of perfect lab studies, and these are controlled environments. What is your reaction to that? And how do you adjust, whether it's, hey, I'm going to let it play out in the training session and see if it's just having a good shitty day, or is it, okay, I'm going to make some wholesale decisions this week because we're not progressing the weight that we want, and this week is going to convert to maybe a deload week or a week that we're going to recalibrate. So what happens when we do not make the rate of progression that we want?
Turning the week into a consolidation week is first instinct. And then, so you also kind of understanding the method that you're using at the time. Like, are you intentionally doing some sort of controlled overtraining? We're like, hey, I know, you're a little achy right now. You got the sniffles, your performance is dropping. That's okay. Give it another 2 weeks. Here's some more support, glutamine, all that stuff. Right. And you're going to see a tremendous rebound versus if I'm not doing that. And those are also very limited circumstances too, right? Like you maybe 10-second eccentrics, maybe, and anytime you're doing multiple times a day, right? Like so with athletes, you're not dealing with that situation very much. And I've had that done to me unknowingly twice to see how I responded, and I did not like it, nor did I appreciate it. But going to the consolidation week has always been, or even a day, like from private sector standpoint, right? It's go home, right? We're set 3. These are so much worse than last week. You're done. From a team setting standpoint, it's like, all right, finish this set. Now we're going to do some calves, some forearms, some abs, some, maybe it's just some gameplay in some form or fashion with med ball tossing, or, there's any number of things you can do that's not sending that individual home, but taking load off the nervous system immediately and then giving it time. And there has been no instance in the last, 25 years that hasn't worked effectively. And it's not easy to do that as a coach either, especially in the private sector where you're like, bro, I'm paying you for one-on-one sessions. Like, that's okay. We're, 15, 20 minutes in, like, I'm not charging you for this, go home. You're going to come back in 3 days and we're going to crush it. Works every time. And I mean, it's even better with athletes too, and I've always found that I feel like nothing really shows a kid like that, at least in my experience, that like how much I care is I'm not going to try to push you through this, because I understand, like, if it's a kid that works hard day in, day out, something's off. I remember one of the last times I had this happen was we were training for a pro day, and we had started Hepburn on Monday with upper, and this kid's always comes in, walks kind of springy walks, super outgoing. He does like motivational speaking now, so that's the kind of guy it was. And he comes in with his hood on, didn't want to talk. Like, I probably didn't say 2 words to me before we started his power cleans. And, within the end of the warm up for a power clean, it's like, go home. I need you to get these 3 things from the store on your way home. We're going to do this. You're not coming. This was Tuesday, or you're not coming back in here till Friday. And kid comes back in on Friday, pissed walking out the door, comes back in on Friday, felt great. And that consolidation, that deloading, whatever you want to call your style of doing that, is there's so much value in doing that when that happens.
So I don't want to play devil's advocate on this, but let's say hypothetically you do that all the time, just making case by case, day by day situations. How are you appraising how many times you're deviating from the normal plan And how were you, I guess, debriefing on whether that was an effective decision or not? And is it they came back and did great, or is that like in the moment you have some sort of, you want confirmational bias that you're like, that was the right call. I sent them home. I took money out of my pocket and I had them come back 3 days, and I want them to be good because I made that decision as a direct impact on me. Like, how are you controlling against these things that you're like, okay, there are always deviations from the plan. There are always necessary deviations, but making sure that you made the right call and you're always moving towards a true north and getting that person to the outcome that they want.
For me, every time so far that I've done it, it's been immediately apparent when they walk back in the door. They're like that kid when he came back in on Friday. He was like, "Man, I'm sorry, I got so mad at you. Like, I feel so much better." And then we crushed the next session. Same thing has happened with the Gen Pop folks. Obviously with Gen Pop, you can lean a little bit more towards like, all right, we're gonna do some non-neural stuff, calves, abs, maybe some light pump work with the arms, just so you can feel like you got your money's worth, and we'll give you a day off tomorrow unplanned, or something like that. But it's apparent the next day they walk in that you made the right call with, personality, with how they're feeling, and then with the numbers, right? You've then got the data to back it up, right? Because came in on Friday. Our Friday session was speed work, yeah, because we did heavy Hepburn on Monday, so we did his next upper session then on Friday. I didn't want to hit him with lower, and it was for the pro day combine stuff, right? We were doing 225 work. We weren't doing 225, but prepping for that, right? So it was cluster work with some chains. So not quite as nearly demanding, more hypertrophy driven to go along with the Hepburn. Came back in on Monday, and his Hepburn numbers, I expected between 4 and 7%, and we were like 12. Because he had so much time to rebound. And then the next day, the lower body numbers were okay, right? So, but then I've also had the same situation where when you come back in, we wouldn't do Hepburn because it puts you under, right? Like, so it's kind of understanding like, all right, well, maybe that's not the right method for this individual, and understanding or having some way to assess whether it's like like you guys, when I was out for muscle mentorship, you had your like readiness questionnaire on the iPads, right? Like if you're good to go when you come in and then you're trashed by the third set, like, all right, or when you come back in, if you're not the big happy face on your reading, we're going to change the method. Like if you're not 100% when you come back in, all right, we're going to do 5 sets of Hepburn and not actually do Hepburn anymore, right? Because 8's just too much. You're doing 5 A's, maybe 2 or 3 B's. So you have to have enough confidence and flexibility to know that Hepburn's not sacred and magical, right? Like you can mess with it a little bit. I've got like 3 or 4 different, I got Hepburn A, Hepburn B. They've all got kind of different connotations for different types.
I guess that would be my follow-up question. And for record, Hepburn A is 8x1 with 2 sets of 5 backoffs, right? That's kind of the Hepburn one that you're working off of.
Yeah.
So 8x1, so you're gonna do 10 total work sets, 8 singles at 90% and above, and then 2 sets of 5 at, let's say, 80, 85%, right? That kind of range. Now, person can't do it. Let's say it's a 3-week meso, and week 2, they can't do it, right? They're physiologically not ready for it. They're in a bad mood. They're overtrained state. They've hit their threshold, whether it's lifestyle related or whatever the variables in there. How do you, in that situation, appraise you and your decision making to utilize a Hepburn A in that situation, and saying, okay, they hit the wall way too early. That was a bad choice. And what do you do in that situation going forward with that person of like, I'm going to pivot and I'm going to go to Hepburn B, or I'm just going to scratch that protocol together and we're going to start a new meso. Like, walk through that. Like, all right, now I'm appraising me as a decision maker from upfront programming, like 8x1 with 2 sets of 5 is the panacea. This is going to unlock every single one of these guys' goals, dreams, and everything they ever hoped for with, okay, it's not working. Okay, I have to now give myself some harsh criticism, not a good decision because they just weren't physiologically capable of doing that. Or on the other end of it is, okay, now I'm going to not just let the ship go down. I'm going to pivot and I'm going to go this direction. And how does that decision occur?
So it's like there's a lot of onus on you to figure out what you did wrong, right? Because you're the one that told them what to do. So did I select the wrong method for the wrong person? Was it at the wrong time, right? Because we know like all these methods are great, but they may not necessarily. What I've learned as I developed that the neural performance map is that it's not necessarily even the individual or the type. It could be just the wrong time for them, right? Like they may be in a really shitty, stressed state these 6 weeks, and Hepburn may be totally great for them. But because I didn't assess that state, right? That's kind of what necessitated doing something like this. Is like I pick a great method and that didn't work, and they failed way too soon. So how do I figure out if the system's failing under the like percentage of intensity? Are they failing under the volume? Or is it any some sort of combination of both? Or is it too much for the week? And so when you kind of start to examine that, right? So for me, it's in the test results. But before all that, it's a bit of a crapshoot. So first you go consolidation, right? So like, all right, let's see how this works going from 8 back to 2 to 3. Well, if you do that on week 2, it's going to be kind of challenging to jump back to say 7 sets or back to 8 on week 3, right? So, well, what do I do? What do I do then? Well, then it's just move on, right? You did great with 3 sets. So it's probably the amount of sets, right? So I know the system's not able to handle more than say 5 sets. You could stick with the Hepburn format, for example, since we're talking about that, but just cut it down to 5 sets. But as you move on, you're like, well, there's probably better ways for me to get more results out of 5 sets than something like Hepburn. But if you cut it down to like your consolidation week, 3 sets, and the intensity is still the problem, then you've got to change your relative intensity for the individual in terms of like or relative intensity, reps in reserve, all that stuff, right? So like, all right, if I could do something like Hepburn, but it's not going to be with a 2 or 3 RM, right? We're going to be 5 RM, add some change, make sure we got some velocity on the bar. And what you'll see is that those are typically the individuals that'll do better on a lower exercise exchange ratio, right? Like you may be flat barbell bench pressing for 12 weeks. And all of them, because of that, all of them are going to be somewhat submaximal. But then you're doing 1 1/4, you're adding chains. In that one phase, you got to pause, maybe an isometric, because you're doing that same pattern. And once you've understood if it's percent intensity, if it's reps in reserve, relative intensity, or just sheer numbers of sets, or even mechanical load, even like we talked about, then you can start to adjust that programming accordingly and figure out like, all right, we're gonna change your exercises way less, but now we got to dial back, right? It's the opposite of West Side, which I think you never really hear that many people talk about, right? Like everybody gets West Side. You're going full RPMs every session, so you got to change the exercise. Well, that makes perfect sense. But then you see people doing the Poliquin style undulation, changing the exercise every 3 weeks, but you're doing the step loading or whatever. Well, maybe you shouldn't change the pattern so much, right? Just change some of the variables of the pattern, the speed or the pauses or any of that stuff. And you can get way more mileage out of it. But the polyclones are so scared of not 90-degree ruling. You press this way, so you've got to do this afterwards. Like, well, no, you don't. It's a lot of ways to accomplish this.
Well, I guess that kind of goes into my last question here, because this is to me the hardest part of it all, is we don't have a control and we don't have a comparable. How do you determine the intervention and the programming decisions you make, and then follow it up with the actual execution of that intervention as its overall effectiveness without any kind of comparable, right? So I don't have a twins that I'm training simultaneously, and it shows this progression with this person, and this progression with this person, and this one garnered better results, and this one garnered less results. Like, how were you looking at that and going, okay, typically they're going to improve, right? We know that they're going to get stronger and faster if you just train. The question would be is, was that more or less than we could have done if we did something else? And how are you evaluating that at the end as like a post-mortem and going, okay, I should have did this differently based off of I thought this was going to be more, or on top of it, like, and it's like same thing with finances. Like I expect to make this much money doing this type of business. I didn't make it. What went wrong? Kind of like appraisal and having some sort of indexing of the decisions that you made and going, okay, I don't want to make that same mistake twice, or I want to make sure I double down on this because that was really effective.
So you've definitely got some, I think, some periodization skills that you can hone in on to at least give you some sort of barometer, right? Like if you're from accumulation 1 to phase 3, if you're increasing your intensity by 10%, then you should be seeing some sort of appreciable 10% change in some level of strength, right? And if you're not, by the end of it, like another going back to Bondarchuk is it seems so simple saying it out loud, but it's something I never really thought about. And so he would say, if you're not testing your, like, say, SPP exercise or exercises at the end of a GPP block, you have no idea if all the GPP shit you did is any good. You just did a bunch of random GPP stuff that has no carryover to your SPP exercises. So I think the sequencing of exercises is a really important big picture tool. And one of the things that I'll do a lot is sandwich. Your final phase exercise will probably be the same variation of the first one. And so you're looking at how much did my percentage of intensity change over the course of that, right? Your dopamine type of guys are going to see a bigger spike, whereas that individual that's not going to change, like if they're flat pressing the entire 12 weeks, you're going to see a much slow cooker approach. So we're looking at, all right, it may take you 6 months to get the same percent jump on your 1RM that it takes that dopamine guy 12 weeks, right? Just because of the sheer output that they can handle. So that has to factor in your decision making, is that I know this person is redlining their effort every single set. So it's going to be higher than, person B over here who is 2 or 3 in the tank every set. It's going to be slower with them. Their nervous system, whatever, all that stuff is just a slower grind than some of the other guys. So I think that is a super important thing to just be aware of, that you're not going to have two bodies make the same percentage jumps. Because you've also got like to your question, could we have made a bigger jump if we did this? And that's where I think you can backtrack and look more into the neurotransmitter aspect of things. Like, that method is really probably not the best shot for this person in hindsight. And because you can compare your phases, right? If your first intensification phase versus your second intensification phase, if you did two completely different styles, you really shouldn't see a tremendous spike in any style or the other, right? Like if you're progressing 4 to 10%, that's probably going to be how you progress across the board. And if you're jumping 30%, that's probably not going to maintain, right? So you've got to hold some people, you have to hold back. So I think those are kind of my best tools in the toolbox as far as that's concerned, is just, like I've got 2 menopausal females right now, right? Like on one of their exercises from week 2 to week 3, they had a 26% delta. Like, hey, that's fantastic. Probably didn't try hard enough. Like, look at this exercise, you only went up like 5%. That's actually better because you were grinding on that one, whereas this one you just kind of sandbag the first 2 weeks. So you kind of have to look at that too, right? Like we know just kind of in general that maybe 12% is probably like your most realistic delta if you're not redlining every set.
Yeah. Wow, man, this has been fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. You got a course coming up here in end of April, correct?
So we're going to cancel the April course just because of all the shenanigans with wait times and TSA.
Okay.
And that stuff.
Okay, but you're going to do it online?
No, it's gonna be in person. It's just
Okay.
old, like only in person.
Yeah.
There is an online component though to it. So we've got let's see, probably 3.5 hours of just like pre-course videos, just so we can get more out of our 3 days.
Nice.
Because there's a lot to this. It's a pretty big system with the regulatory state and training demand, right? Introducing new concepts like extensive, intensive, and explosive to be able to delineate like every accumulation phase doesn't accomplish the same objective. And that ties into the whole individualization process too.
Okay, so Outlaw Way, that's where we're going to find all this and just dive into it. And any other things that we want to discuss before we break here?
Metabolic Elite is going to be at Smer Strong.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. That's gonna be awesome, man.
Come see us. We'll have some samples, I guess.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be metabolically elite. I can't wait for that. Yeah, but fire it up, man. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate you. I'll put everything, how to find you and all that good stuff in the notes here, so people can get all your great intel and concepts and stuff. And just appreciate the time, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, brother.